Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very special day on which we are very privileged to have Dr. Manisha Sinha, who will give the keynote address for our Mandela Day and then hold a Q&A session following her talk. I am Dr. Sakina Hughes, Assistant Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Director of Africana Studies and the Chair of the Mandela Social Justice Day Committee. So every year, this is a campus-wide effort, and we have a lot of thank yous. We would like to thank the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, Dean Beebe and the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Nursing and Health Professions, the Pott College of Science, Engineering and Education, the Romaine College of Business, Housing and Residence Life, the Counseling Center, the Center for Social Justice Education, Gender Studies, Africana Studies, and the Multicultural Center. Finally, I want to thank my co-chair, Dr. Denise Lin, and the wonderful committee that pulls this together every February. You all have been really a joy to work with over these few years. The mission of the Nelson Mandela Social Justice Day and Speaker Series is to raise dialogue around the issues, current issues of social justice, human rights and civil rights, public service and activism through diverse, dynamic, nationally and internationally known public intellectuals and academics. We aim to augment each speaker's visit with a day of educational opportunities for the USI community. In these activities, we hope to commemorate Nelson Mandela, an internationalist educator, activist, and champion of human and civil rights. This year, we have had the added bonus of hosting a teach-in, and I hope you were able to attend some of those events yesterday and earlier today. Nelson Mandela was a South African nationalist, a democratic socialist, an anti-colonial freedom fighter, and an anti-racist activist, and a political prisoner for a third of his long life. He was imprisoned for his efforts to liberate South Africans from apartheid, racism, and colonialism. In addition to fighting in these struggles, he also played a crucial part in reconciliation efforts and the recreation of South Africa as an interracial democracy. His legacy is inspirational to those who seek a world in which social justice reigns and human rights issues guide our leaders to create better societies. We remember that Mandela was considered a criminal in his country for standing up for what was just and right. He made great sacrifices to make this world a better place. We hope that this day will inspire you to take action to create a better society in your communities to commemorate this great man and all freedom fighters across the globe. Okay, now without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Dean Beebe, who will give the introduction for Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you, even though via Zoom and not in person. It's a real honor for me to have the opportunity to do the introduction here today, and I'm just going to get to that in a moment. But before I do, I just want to say thank you to every student that's making the time to be on this Zoom today. We are here to serve our students and to serve the community. So community members that are here also, thank you for making time, particularly on a snowy day where just getting out of your driveway is a real chore and difficult. I've not been able to do it much myself. So please stay safe and well over the next few days in particular. And just want to say thank you to everyone for making the time. And also to thank you to the committee for all their excellent work, and particularly Dr. Hughes, who really has been a driving force behind organizing these events, reaching out to our speakers every year, and just making this a wonderful experience for everyone, and to showcase the kind of amazing work that our students are doing, but also the importance of social justice and all the wonderful educational opportunities that the University of Southern Indiana provides. So I just really am thankful to her and to everyone. And I particularly want to just mention one other group, and that is my fellow dean colleagues in the other three colleges. It's pretty unusual at a university to have all four academic colleges working together to bring amazing events and help to transform lives. And that only happens because the four deans, including myself, work so well together. This is about the greater good and helping everyone. So I just want to thank Ann White, Kathy Kerry and Zane Mitchell, my three colleagues in the other three colleges, for their support and their help. And it's not just financial, it's the kind of intellectual support, the personal support that they have given. Without them, this would not be possible. So I just want to recognize each of my colleagues. Thank you, everyone. All right, so it's my pleasure to do the introductions today, and I'm very excited because I'm introducing a fellow historian, historian of the 19th century, of American history, and I'm just really, really excited to do this. So let me just sort of do an introduction, and then we will have questions and answer after the presentation. Dr. Manisha Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction in the United States. She was born in India and received her Ph.D. from Columbia University in New York, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize, which is an amazing prize to be nominated for. She is the author of The Counterrevolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books in slavery in Politico in 2015. And I've read it, it's an amazing book. And recently featured in the New York Times 1619 project. Her multiple award-winning second monograph, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and is an amazing piece of work. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including 2 year-long research fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as 2 from the Mellon Foundation. Very impressive indeed. In 2018, she was a visiting professor at the University of Paris, Diderot, and was elected to the Society of American Historians, a great honor. She is a member of the board of the Society of Civil War Historians and the Council of Advisors of the Lapidus Center for Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery at the Schomburg, New York Public Library, which really is a high honor indeed. She taught at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, for over 20 years, where she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest recognition bestowed on faculty. She is currently writing a book on the greater reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, something I'm very interested in myself, which is under contract with Liverite, that's part of Norton. Professor Sinha has written for many publications and news outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, the Boston Globe, Dissent, The Nation, Jacobin, and the Huffington Post, and has been interviewed by the national and international press. So she's a very busy person. She has appeared on Democracy Now!, The Daily Show, TLC's Who Do You Think You Are, and was an advisor and on-screen expert for the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary, The Abolitionists, which came out in 2013. She has lectured all over the country and internationally in the UK, my homeland, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Australia, India, Ireland, and New Zealand. She lives in Massachusetts with her husband and their 2 sons and their dog, Wiley. What an impressive resume. So please join me in giving Dr. Sinha a USI welcome. Dr. Sinha, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Beebe, for that very generous introduction. And I would also like to thank Dean Hughes for inviting me today, and to the entire student and faculty community at the University of Southern Indiana for hosting me. I am sharing my screen with you because I know I'm going to be talking to you for a while, and it might enliven the presentation. But I, as Dean Beebe mentioned to you, am a historian of the long 19th century. So really going anywhere from the American Revolution right up to the end of Reconstruction, the overthrow of Reconstruction. And what I wanted to do today was to talk to you a little bit about my field, the 19th century United States history, and reflect a little bit on how that history informs our present. And unless we really reckon with that history, it would be difficult to imagine how we can address some of the challenges that we face today, whether one is an activist or a student or an academic. These are things that I think most American citizens should know and should be aware of. It's Nelson Mandela Day at the University of Southern Indiana. And unlike South Africa, the United States has never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to reflect on its past. We tend to be rather glib about our past. We think, well, yes, slavery existed a long time ago and we have overcome it, and that American democracy has just progressed in a simple, uncontested way. And that, most historians will tell you, is not exactly true. American democracy has always been contested. There have been people who have fought on the right side of the cause and on the wrong side. Unless we know that, it is difficult for us today as intellectuals, as activists, as scholars, to really confront some of the problems that we face in our society and think about how we can better our condition and how we can perfect our democracy, because it is a common project, even though many times it is not talked about in that manner. So let me begin with talking, about what I think are the long-term influences of the history of slavery on this country, but also the long-term influences of the history of fighting against slavery, against racism, and that is the abolition movement, which remains a prototype of radical activism in the United States. Some of you may have heard about the 1619 Project. I know some of you have been studying about it in your classes, and how controversial that has been to really popularize the history of slavery, because that is what the project did. It chose 1619 as the date when Africans landed in British North America. But of course, we know that people of African descent had landed on the North American continent with Spanish conquistadors and enslavers long before in the 16th century. No matter, the point of the project was to talk about the history of slavery and its lasting influences in American history. And that gave rise to some political controversy amongst a few who thought that that was highlighting a problematic aspect of our history that we should now not be thinking about. And instead, Trump established a 1776 commission to talk about the achievements of American democracy. The problem with that commission, of course, was that there was no historian on it. No historian was consulted. And so it presented a very simple history, an unproblematic history, one that was incomplete, that left out a lot of things, and that in fact was riddled with errors, as the American Historical Association pointed out in its statement. So even if we look at the histories of slavery and abolition as beginning with the founding of American democracy, rather than looking at the prehistory of these things. Remember, slavery was legal in all the 13 colonies, that people of African descent had resisted slavery on the west coast of Africa the moment that they are being enslaved, in shipboard rebellions, and also in colonial America. So the history of slavery and abolition really goes way beyond the founding of the American Republic. But even if we look at the founding of the American Republic, one can see how the existence of slavery really marred the achievements of the founders, and how it created a division that would lead up to the Civil War. Some of you who are familiar with US history, may have studied this in school, will know these markers. What's important to remember is that increasingly historians are talking about the early American Republic as a slave-holding republic, even though most of the northern states gradually abolished slavery, beginning with Vermont and ending with New Jersey. They got rid of slavery by the early 19th century. The US Constitution itself had many compromises over slavery. The 3/5 clause that gave slaveholders additional power in the federal government by counting 3/5 of their enslaved population. The Fugitive Slave Clause that gave Southern laws of slavery recognition, even in the northern free states. And the clause that eventually ended the African slave trade in 1808. These were all compromises over the issue of slavery, mainly between northern states that were moving towards freedom and southern states. And historians and contemporaries have argued, was the US Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? What's true is that you could use many aspects of the US Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, to argue for rights for African Americans, which most abolitionists did right from the start. But it is also true that the Constitution contains some serious compromises over slavery, like the Fugitive Slave Clause. And in fact, in the 1790s, at the very start of the American Republic, there were all these compromises over slavery and recognitions of slavery in federal law. So the first Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1793. And there are other laws that are passed at that time that say people of African descent cannot be citizens and cannot be naturalized, that they were excluded from the militia. They were not even allowed to carry the US mail service because that was seen as incendiary to Southern slaveholders. So here we have a republic that is founded on these ideals that we can all look up to. But on the other hand, the reality was that slavery was gaining more and more protections. So even though those people who argue that the US Constitution was really more anti-slavery in intent, recognize that from the 1790s right up to the 1850s, laws and events took place that made the early American Republic more of a slaveholding republic. And indeed, our first presidents, many of our Supreme Court justices, Congress, the judiciary, they were all dominated by slaveholders who made sure that the interests of slavery were protected. And they not only used the Constitution, but they also passed new laws that gave slavery more and more political power. This is what abolitionists called the slave power in America in order to critique it, an undemocratic power, a power that was vitiating America's experiment in republican government. It is something that, of course, Lincoln would famously articulate in his many speeches during the Civil War, that slavery not only deprived Black people of their freedom, but somehow it was a blot on American democracy. And there were many such compromises. I won't go over all these details because this is not exactly, you're not held captive in my classroom. My students have to listen to me saying this, but it's important to remember that all these markers in American history, from the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state in 1820, to the annexation of Texas as a big slave state into the Union, to the Mexican War that literally expanded the territory of the United States by getting more territories that were open to slavery into the US. All these created a lot of friction between the North and South, but it also shows an expanding slave power, the expansion of slavery. So slavery was not just dying out on its own, as the founders had fondly hoped. In fact, it was growing in strength. And a very small politician from Illinois at that time began his career with opposing the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery, and his name was, of course, Abraham Lincoln. The Mexican War created a lot of problems for the United States. Would these territories be free or slave would determine the future of the American Republic. It led to the Compromise of 1850 between the slave and free states, which also resulted in the passage of another fugitive slave law, which was draconian because it really was demanding that Northern whites act like Southern whites did as slave patrollers. Now, this is important to remember, this history of the fugitive slave laws and of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the US Constitution. The fact that you could apprehend any Black man or woman as a fugitive slave, as, quote, a fugitive of justice, shows you how the criminalization of Blackness really is embedded in the history of slavery. this is something that we still struggle with today in instances of police brutality, the ways in which people, Black people in particular, people of color, are stigmatized or policed or incarcerated. All this has roots and origins in the history of slavery. With the 1850s, you get this growing sort of momentum towards expanding the area of slavery, which began with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the 1850s that allowed slavery to expand even north of, the Missouri Compromise line. Here we are back. And so this is, of course, the act that leads to the rise of the anti-slavery Republican Party. That's the two-party system we live in today. But in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of political liberalism, of anti-slavery, of Lincoln, of, quote, big government. And the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy, states' rights, and racism, of white supremacy. The parties have pretty much flipped roles today, so it sometimes can get confusing. But this is when the Republican Party is born, and this, of course, directly leads to Lincoln's election as president. And then, of course, the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, which you should remember, because the Dred Scott decision famously said that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. So Black people could never aspire to be citizens of the United States, which was, of course, an extremely problematic idea. And it was one which both anti-slavery politicians and abolitionists would oppose. And it's not just the political expansion of the powers of slavery that we need to pay attention to, but also the political economy of slavery. Slavery was not a sideshow when it comes to the economy of the United States. Historians call this the empire of cotton. Slaveholders famously used to argue cotton is king because cotton was, of course, the staple crop most associated with slavery, even though you had other cash crops that were grown in the South. In the 19th century, not only did the United States expand through the Trans-Mississippi West, but the empire of cotton expanded. Cotton was the largest item of export from the United States, slave-grown cotton. Its value exceeded the value of all other items of export. Slave-grown cotton from the United States fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain first, and then in New England. Many of the cotton textile mills that became the first to develop the factory system and to mechanize and to inaugurate the Industrial Revolution depended on slave-grown cotton. So this is not, as I said, a sideshow. And increasingly, historians have seen that slave-grown cotton and the agricultural plantation economy of the South was not so much at odds with a northern economy. They, in fact, were complementary. That northern economic growth, whether it was insurance, shipping, industry, just as it happened with Britain earlier on with the slave trade, was very much linked to slavery. So again, when we think about modern debates now over reparations for slavery or apologies for slavery, we need to remember the central place that slavery had in the nation's political economy. I talk a lot about things that make me feel better rather than be pessimistic. And that is, in my second book, as Dean Beebe mentioned, I looked at the history of abolition. And the reason why I looked at this was to see how powerful the slave interests or the slave power was in the United States and who the people who opposed it. The idea that somehow we just got rid of slavery because the founding ideals were good is absolutely wrong, as you can see, because even though we had those ideals, slavery did not die out. It was becoming more and more powerful and it was expanding more. Well, there were Americans who always objected to slavery. the abolitionists. You will hear that term abolition bandied about quite a bit by modern day activists. And the reason why they use it is because abolition remains the template of a successful radical movement in the United States. These were not powerful men and women. They were Black men and women. They were white men and women at a time when Black people and women were defined outside the formal body politic, who took part in a radical social movement in order to break the national silence over slavery and to protest against it. And one of the main points that I argue in this book, going back, to the 18th century, but throughout the 19th century, the different waves of abolition, is that African Americans were not just like passive recipients of the gift of freedom. They were the central activists in abolition. It was, in fact, the enslaved themselves who ran away from slavery, who petitioned for their freedom, who fought against slavery in various ways. In fact, Massachusetts abolishes slavery because some enslaved men and women sue for their own freedom. This is not the history of emancipation that one is commonly taught in schools, but it is important to remember that. The reason why you have a fugitive slave controversy between the North and South is because fugitive slaves actually voted with their feet and ran away from slavery, and they create a political issue. So it's really important to understand the central role that African Americans, but slave resistance in particular, plays in the history of slavery. Just before William Lloyd Garrison starts publishing his iconic newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831, you had African American abolitionists fighting for Black rights in the courts, on the streets, and you had slave rebellions like Nat Turner's slave rebellion that took place actually the same year. So the argument of the book, and if you're interested, you can always read the book, is that slave resistance was not separate from abolition, that it was constitutive of it, that it is what inspires white abolitionists like Garrison. In fact, Garrison completely adopts the Black abolitionist program, which is not only to fight against slavery, but to fight for equal Black rights, for Black citizenship. That's important to remember, because Black citizenship, Black voting rights, Black civil rights, Black political rights, equality before the law, these are issues that we are still contesting today. So the abolitionist legacy is an extremely important one to study with the history of slavery, because if you study one without the other, you do not get a complete picture of US history, and you do not get a picture of how it can inform so many things in our present, including, issues of mass incarceration on the one hand, and on the other hand, activism against racial injustice. Now, when the abolitionist movement began, it was not greeted with open arms. This was a radical minority. They were seen as, quote, promiscuous because they allowed the mingling of Blacks and whites and men and women in their societies, in their meetings. And many times they were targets of anti-abolitionist violence. They would be stoned, they would be shouted at. There's many such instances throughout the 1830s. And sometimes leading politicians were part of mob violence against abolitionists. Now, you saw the Capitol Hill riot, and a lot of people said, oh my God, this is not what America is all about. And to a certain extent, they're right, because it hasn't happened so frequently in our recent past. But if you go back to the 19th century, you can find many such instances of violence against people and against democratic governance, against people demanding rights. And anti-abolitionist violence is one of those sorry chapters in American history where abolitionists are attacked both in the North and the South. This is a famous illustration of the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, which was put up by abolitionists so that they could meet and make speeches, because many times town halls, etc., would not give them their halls halls to organize or to speak. So they constructed their own hall. A mob violently attacked and burnt this hall down. And throughout the 1830s and 1840s, you have instances of mob violence against African Americans and abolitionists in northern cities and in the South. Especially in northern cities, with the rise of the abolition movement, Black communities are attacked, their churches are burnt, their schools are burnt. All this form of racial violence that unfortunately has cropped up again in the United States was quite common in 19th century America. And politically, too, they tried to stamp out the abolition movement. In Congress, they passed a gag rule between 1836 and 44 in the House, and the Senate it lasted longer, where they refused to listen to abolitionist petitions. They refused to carry abolitionist mail in the US mail. They tried to censor the US mail. Southern mobs attacked US postal offices and burned them down rather than have abolitionist literature delivered to them. So the US Postal Service is really important. You may have read about some of the controversies recently surrounding it in the last elections, but that is a very democratic part of our society. It is a way to disseminate knowledge for a lot of people, which you may not understand the significance of in our digital age, but in the 19th century, it would be like shutting down the internet so that you could not voice your opinions. So civil liberties, the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom of press, all that gets very much tied up with the issue of Black freedom. And this is what the great Black intellectual and historian and scholar and activist and one of the founders of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, famously said. He said that the cause of the American slave is inextricably linked with the cause of American democracy. And many white Northerners started seeing that, who objected to abolitionists being attacked, who objected to abolitionist newspapers being burned, and who finally objected to the murder of an abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, in Alton, Illinois, by a pro-slavery mob. He died defending his press. They had burned his press 3 or 4 times before he died. And interestingly, Lincoln makes one of his most famous speeches against mob rule, where he talks about the lynching of suspected slave rebels in Mississippi and the murder of Elijah Lovejoy as a real stain on American democracy. So here you see even an anti-slavery moderate like Lincoln making those connections, understanding how the slave's cause is linked to the cause of American democracy, and the history of abolition kind of illustrates that. What's interesting about the abolitionist movement, though, is that it provides a space for African Americans to be heard politically. This was a time when Black men, because women, of course, did not have the right to vote in any of the states. Briefly, they had in New Jersey just after the revolution, but generally they were not given the right to vote. But Black men had the right to vote in a handful of New England states. So that's why the abolitionist fight was always not just against slavery, but also for Black equality. And African Americans play a very important part in not just determining this abolitionist agenda, but slave resistance directly feeds into the abolition movement. Some of the most famous Black abolitionists were fugitive slaves themselves. Of course, you all know Frederick Douglass, hopefully, Harriet Tubman, others whom you may not have heard of, James W.C. Pennington, who becomes the first Black man to get a doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, or William Wells Brown, who lived in England for a long time and took on Thomas Carlyle and wrote a lot there. So they were international celebrities in a way, these Black Americans who lacked the basic rights of citizenship, who were Jim Crowed all the time in the United States, emerged as leaders of the abolition movement. Douglass, Wells Brown, So I went further ahead. Their speeches in Britain, in Europe, they were widely respected, where they spoke out against slavery. And slaveholders in particular saw them as a threat because they could dismiss Northern whites as not having any firsthand knowledge of slavery. But fugitive slaves who wrote their narratives and wrote about their experiences in slavery provided the best answer to the pro-slavery argument, which was, oh, we look after our slaves, we treat them very well, we are very benevolent and paternalistic. Instead, slave narratives literally were dripping with blood because they talked about whippings and family separations and the domestic slave trade and things that slaveholders really did not want the world to know about being driven to labor from sunup to sundown, the punishments and the tortures involved, the daily tortures involved in being enslaved. So they were very effective abolitionist leaders. Douglass, of course, meditates broadly about the connections between slavery and democracy. And I would recommend to any of you to read his first narrative. It's only 40 pages long, and it's probably one of the most thoughtful indictments of slavery, or any one of his speeches on abolition. There were others like Henry Bibb, who published a newspaper called Voice of the Fugitive in Canada. Many of these people escaped all the way to Canada because in the North, you could still be sent back to the South as a runaway slave. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who traveled all over the world, including Britain and Jamaica, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote her iconic female slave narrative in 1860. It was published, and it is often studied today as looking at the particular oppressions that women faced under slavery in terms of sexual assault and abuse, or even the threat of it, but also the ways in which they were used not just for the production as free labor of crop, but also reproduction, because they were literally reproducing the slave labor force for slaveholders. So her narrative is a very thoughtful reflection on that. And then there were some great stories also of fugitivity. A man called Henry Brown, who was called famously Henry Box Brown, because he boxed himself and shipped himself to freedom, had himself shipped to freedom. Then there was William and Ellen Croft, who became very famous because she was so fair. She dressed up as a slaveholder, and he dressed up as her slave, and they escaped all the way from Georgia to Massachusetts to Canada, and eventually went to Britain when they were being hunted down by their master. They came back after the Civil War to try to help emancipated slaves in their home state of Georgia after the Civil War. So these are amazing stories of activism by people who had been enslaved and then who came to lead the abolition movement. And so they're really important to think about when we think about how history moves. It is sometimes the activism and the heroism of ordinary people who've been victimized by oppression and injustice, like Mandela was, and others who have really swung the pendulum of history to the right side. It is not the most powerful or the most eminent people. These are the people who create these radical social movements that then pressure the political system to pass laws or to act in ways that responds to their agitation. And that's why Garrison's motto was always agitate, 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 agitate for justice. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the 1850s and connect it to present day events. Many of you may have seen the image of this man with the Confederate battle flag, which made its appearance in the halls of the Capitol. It did not during the Civil War, but it did when white supremacists carried what I call the rebel rag of treason into Congress. And the attempt, of course, was violent. To assassinate our elected leaders. Luckily, that did not happen. There were brave police officers who laid down their lives and were badly injured trying to prevent that. We know that that this was one of the low points in the history of American democracy. And what was interesting about this episode was that there was an picture here of a man, and that man was an abolitionist from Massachusetts, Senator Charles Sumner. And Charles Sumner was known for his abolitionist speeches in Congress. And oops, I am moving it more than I should. And he was, despised by Southerners because of his abolitionism. And Southerners tended to be pretty violent. They would come armed to Congress. They would threaten Northerners sometimes. But this was the most violent thing that happened in Congress before the Capitol Hill riot. And that was the caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks, a slaveholder from South Carolina. He beat him unconscious, and Sumner's chair remained empty in Congress until he came back, recovered from his wounds, and came back in 1860 and made a famous speech called The Barbarism of Slavery. And this coincided, Bleeding Sumner, as they called it, coincided with what they called Bleeding Kansas. After the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Southerners tried to make sure that this state would be a slave state. So there's another precedent to the Capitol Hill riots that we saw of using violence to disrupt electoral processes, to disrupt democratic governance. And that was the sort of annual invasions of Kansas by border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri. David Atchison, interestingly enough, one of the main supporters of the Capitol Hill riots, is a current senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley. His predecessor was David Atchison, a rabidly pro-slavery politician who encouraged Missourians to invade Kansas and to basically steal elections there. And so we've had these instances in American history where violent white supremacist pro-slavery mobs have tried to disrupt elections. And Kansas became a kind of a dress rehearsal to the Civil War. And it was one of the reasons why the Republican Party came into power, because Northerners were so disgusted at the disruption of democratic norms in the country. If we go further, you will see that there has been another instance when the peaceful transfer of power, in the United States has been disrupted. A lot of people have looked at the presidential elections of 2020, the one that we recently had, in which the victor won decisively by 7 million votes, and yet there was a questioning of the results. People who would also resort to any means, even violence, in order to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. Again, something Americans are not used to. You think about this, you think, oh, this is some third world country, some banana republic where this happens. This does not happen in the United States, but in fact, it did happen. And it happened in a big way in the 19th century. So I wrote about it in my first book, The Counterrevolution of Slavery, which is what secession was. Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency in 1860 on an anti-slavery platform. What's interesting about Lincoln's election, is that most of the Deep South states refused to accept his election. That was the last time that you had a questioning of a presidential election. They seceded. That is what secession was. Rather than accept the results of a democratic, lawful election, they seceded from the Union. They said, okay, we are no longer part of this. These were the Deep South states stretching from Texas to South Carolina that seceded from the American Union rather than accept Lincoln's election. They then fired on federal forts, which made the Lincoln administration fire back, and that led to the secession of 4 more Upper South states. So this led to the Civil War. So when people were saying, as a Civil War historian, I was like rather stunned. I said, don't you all remember the last time this happened? It led to civil war. So it is extremely dangerous. to question democratic and lawful elections. Because once you do that, you're going down a very dangerous road. And American history itself shows us that. And secession was that. It was the counter-revolution of slavery. In order to protect slavery, they could not even imagine a president who had been elected not as an abolitionist, but one who was simply committed to the non-expansion of slavery into Western territories, which of course was inhabited by Native American nations. It was not as if they were open for settlement, but that was the point of controversy between the slave and free states on the eve of the Civil War. Now, the war, of course, leads to emancipation, and it is important to remember some of the ways in which emancipation came about. Because what Black people did was they did exactly what fugitive slaves had done in the antebellum era. The moment the war started, they started fleeing into Union Army lines in large numbers. So they saw the Union and Lincoln as their liberators before they adopted that role, before Lincoln himself adopted that role. Lincoln was careful to say this is a war for the Union because there were still 4 border slave states that were still a part of the Union that had not seceded, and he could not afford to lose them at the beginning of the war. So even though he was a man of sincere anti-slavery belief, he actually said this is just a war for the Union. I'm not going to make slavery an issue. But slavery quickly became an issue. Already in the first year of the war, Congress is passing these confiscation acts. Union Army commanders are saying enslaved people who come to our lines are free because they are, quote, contraband of war. Contraband is a technical term, which means the property of your enemy. So they're defining enslaved people as property, not as human beings. Abolitionists didn't like that. Garrison said, these are self-emancipated slaves. They're not contraband. But however we use those terms, it resulted in the freedom of Black people who started fleeing into Union Army lines. Soon Congress acted and said, we confiscate all slaves being used by the Confederacy. Then they said, we will confiscate all slaves of secessionist slaveholders. That was the second Confiscation Act. Then they passed a Militia Act saying that all Black people can join the Union Army, which of course they were prohibited to, right from the 1790s. Even though, of course, African Americans had served both in the Continental Army and in the War of 1812. Finally, of course, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, which basically frees all enslaved people in the Confederacy, not those that are part of the Union Army. And that's why at the end of the war, you needed a constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment, that eventually abolishes slavery. Now, you may have heard about this quite a bit recently because there's a lot of talk about the criminal exception in the 13th Amendment. When the framers of the 13th Amendment put that in, they were simply adopting the language of older laws, like the Northwest Ordinance. They were not trying to criminalize Black freedom. Unfortunately, Southerners used that as a loophole against the 13th Amendment eventually. And that's what the criminal exception is all about, in case you have been hearing activists talk about it. There was no intent on the part of the anti-slavery framers of the 13th Amendment to re-enslave Black people, but there was certainly an intent by former slaveholders to try to get around the 13th Amendment to enslave people. I'd be happy to talk more about it if you have any questions about that. Then we have this period called Reconstruction, which I'm writing about right now. And it's a really interesting time because that's when the Republican Party as a whole, and this is after Lincoln's death, moves, though Lincoln is, of course, the first American president to publicly endorse Black citizenship. In fact, he is assassinated because he does that, not because of emancipation. His assassin, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer from Maryland, says, I'm going to kill him because he's for Black citizenship. He clearly says that. So that becomes the major goal of Reconstruction, which is to reconstruct the American Union, bring the slave states back into the Union, or the former slave states. On what terms will they be brought in? And the terms that Congress laid out after Lincoln's assassination was that they would recognize Black male voting and Black rights and Black citizenship. You know, this is the time when you have some of the first Civil Rights Act passed. Unfortunately, somehow this PowerPoint has cut out the first Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is the first time the federal government starts passing civil rights acts. Long before the 20th century. They intervene in Southern affairs in order to make sure that former slaveholders don't come back into power and we go back to square one as we were before the Civil War. They passed the 14th Amendment, extremely important amendment that actually establishes equality before the law. And there are parts of the 14th Amendment that are still being talked about today because many of our expansion of rights comes from the 14th Amendment, including marriage equality, including right to privacy, including no discrimination on the basis of sex. Ruth Bader Ginsburg used the 14th Amendment to argue that case. So the 14th Amendment is extremely important for our citizenship rights today. It's being evoked today against the insurrectionists in the Capitol Hill riot because it has a section that prohibits anyone who commits an act of insurrection against the United States government from holding federal office, especially those who have taken an oath of office to uphold the US Constitution. And you may have seen talk about this after the Capitol Hill riots. It's also the time when they impeach the president, probably one of the worst presidents in US history, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee. He was a Unionist, but he was also a slaveholder, and he was very against Black rights. So he tries to prevent Congress from passing these laws, from doing anything in terms of reconstructing the Union. And he becomes the first American president to be impeached. Of course, Donald Trump is the first American president to be impeached twice. And there are a lot of similarities, actually, between Andrew Johnson's mentality and Donald Trump's, and I've written about that in various outlets. The 15th Amendment, of course, gave Black men the right to vote. What's astonishing about Reconstruction is that you have Black senators and congressmen. This is the first class of Black congressmen and senators from the southern states representing their states in Congress. You have the first Black senators, the first Black lieutenant governors and governors, the first Black congressmen, state and local officials. You know, we haven't had that kind of Black representation in the federal government until the late 20th century after the Civil Rights Movement. So it was an astonishing period that really established interracial democracy in this country. The last of these acts that were passed were the Enforcement Acts, again being used today because they were there mainly to suppress white domestic racist terror in the South by white supremacist groups. People are, in fact, the NAACP has recently started a lawsuit using one of the enforcement acts. There were three of them. The last one was the Ku Klux Klan Act, mainly targeting the Ku Klux Klan against some of the recent right-wing domestic terror groups that have come up and that were instrumental in the Capitol Hill riots on January 6th this year. And finally, they passed a Civil Rights Act that in 1875, another one that was actually authored by Charles Sumner. Remember the guy who got caned? He is the one who authored it. He was a big spokesman for Black equality during Reconstruction, and he basically outlawed all segregation in this act, all kinds of racial segregation. Eventually, when the act was passed, they did away with schools. But initially, as Sumner had visualized it, it was against any kind of racial segregation in public transportation. This is before the rise of Jim Crow, the formal rise of Jim Crow. So it was really prescient. Unfortunately, of course, it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883, paving the way for Jim Crow in the South. The other thing that is important to remember in the context of the Capitol Hill riots is that there was a time when democratic governments and state legislatures and constitutional conventions in the United States were raided by violent white mobs to overthrow democracy. And that's exactly what happens at the end of Reconstruction. When the federal government withdraws from the South, makes a decision actually to withdraw its troops from the South, you have white terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which was pretty much put out by the Enforcement Acts. But you had other white terror groups rising up that start disrupting these interracial state governments that had Black officials. It ends with the famous Wilmington race riot in North Carolina in 1898, where a white mob literally attacks the city government and overthrows it by violence, a coup, basically a coup, a violent coup. So when people said, oh, this can't happen, I said, well, yes, it has happened and it should not happen. For those people who believe that, everything progresses in a linear way, it's important to remember the dangers of not going back to that time period when mob racial violence led to the rise of a Jim Crow South, where African Americans were subjected under new forms of legal and economic servitude, racial segregation, lynching, racial terror, race riots. It is one of the worst chapters in American history, rightly called the nadir, certainly in Black history. And this was formalized by the Supreme Court that started dismantling a Reconstruction by a series of conservative decisions. I already mentioned the 1883 civil rights cases, but the most famous, of course, is Plessy versus Ferguson, which gave the green light to Southern states to establish Jim Crow. So they dismantled Black citizenship, the crowning achievement of Reconstruction, through violence and through legal conservatism, and then later on through a whole bunch of political tactics that Southern states adopted by the 1890s to establish white rule in the South. The grandfather clause, you can vote only if your grandfather voted. Well, guess what? Most former slaves' grandfathers did not vote, or the literacy clause, or the recite the US Constitution before you are allowed to vote. All these tricks at voter suppression and voter intimidation that began in the 19th century and that we still live with the legacies of. A lot of the controversies over voting rights today stem from this period, an inability to imagine Black people as equal voting citizens in this country. Now, it's not as if Black people did not resist, just, there's a long civil rights movement. They resisted this as it was being established even before the civil rights movement. You can see this, for instance, with the establishment of Black organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, Black women's clubs, Black suffragists, the NAACP, before that, the Niagara Movement, the Afro-American Council, the Afro-American League. They're constantly fighting. They don't give up the fight simply because they are being victimized by violence and by reactionary laws. The tradition of Black protest continues, and it eventually coalesces with the rise of the civil rights movement. What's interesting is that many civil rights activists called themselves the new abolitionists and said they demanded a second reconstruction of American democracy. When Dr. King said the Constitution is on our side, he could say that confidently because of the Reconstruction constitutional amendments. The question was the federal government had to enforce those rights. And that's why you had, again, the passage of laws that pretty much replicated what was passed 150 years earlier with Reconstruction, and that was, or 100 years earlier with Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed Jim Crow, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that secured voting rights in the South. These were the triumphs of the civil rights movement and civil rights activism. Again, showing you the connections, some of the Pan-African connections in Black activism. If you look at Dr. King, he is very much influenced by Gandhian notions of nonviolent resistance, and Gandhi himself is influenced by Thoreau and some of the pacifist abolitionists of the United States. So as I said in one of the pieces I wrote, what goes around comes around. And then of course, Nelson Mandela, who is influenced by Gandhi, by Dr. King, and this whole tradition of nonviolent resistance, which does not mean passivity. It means resistance, but through nonviolent means. And that's important to remember. Now, of course, the gains of the civil rights movement, we're like, okay, now the civil rights movement, and we are all secure and we are all fine, and not really. Again, the Supreme Court has acted in ways to dismantle some of these federal laws, most famously in the recent case, look at the date here, 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, who was, of course, President Obama's Attorney General, where the Shelby County, Alabama sued, and the Supreme Court dismantled sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's why today you have people like Stacey Abrams and others, again, fighting those fights for equal voting rights because of something like this. And now we are contemplating the passage of a new Voting Rights Act, which I have argued recently. Those of you who are interested, who are not interested in reading the books, might want to look. I have put up the link for this, a piece that I wrote that says that we really are ready for a third reconstruction of American democracy, not just by evoking the enforcement acts and the 14th Amendment against those who would commit insurrection against the government of the United States, but also those who indulge in white supremacist domestic terror, but also in passing new laws that would secure our voting rights, that would get rid of something like, let's say, indirect elections of the president. We got rid of the indirect elections of senators during the progressive era. So it's high time we think about comprehensive democratic reforms to secure our democracy and to secure voting rights. This was published just recently in the New York Review of Books, and you are, of course, welcome to read it, because there's a whole agenda that I think the Biden-Harris administration could enact, besides dealing with these crises that always become worse when you don't have responsible democratic governance. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know that was a lot to take and a lot of US history, but I really wanted you to have a sense of how our past informs our present and how we may go to the future. So yes, I'm happy to answer questions now.
This question from Dr. Stella Ress. In the wake of history classes being cut from the core more and more frequently, and in the resulting decisions to prune history departments at universities around the country, can you speak to the importance of history as a discipline today?
I think that would be a huge blow to American democracy, actually, because history, American history in particular, gives us lessons in citizenship. And if we are ignorant of that, how can we be responsible citizens today? Even the founders said that in order to be a virtuous citizen, in order to be able to think of the common good beyond your selfish personal interests, you should be an educated citizen. And I really cannot think of this. Now, I am an immigrant from India, and I had to pass a citizenship test in which luckily I'm a historian, so it was kind of easy for me. But, most immigrants have to learn this history in order to become a citizen. Why? Because the United States, even though, again, these ideals are not perfect, but we are founded in ideals where we determine citizenship by our civic ideology, meaning if you pledge an allegiance to the United States Constitution and to American ideals, you're a citizen. There is no ethnic or racial qualification or blood qualification, as there, for instance, is in Germany, where you're German by blood, right? In the US, it's a civic category. So I don't think we should be cutting down on history education at all. I think it's extremely important, especially to understand our present. And history is really interesting. It's often taught in a way that is uninteresting because it's not taught in a way that's true to the past, that brings out the entire complexity of American history. So yes, not just because I'm a historian, but as a citizen, I would say, do not get rid of the humanities, do not get rid of critical thinking, do not get rid of history. They're extremely important. And history is also the activist's muse. So those of you out there who are activists today, history is really important to know.
Thank you so much. And then we've got another question here from Anna Ardeline. So a year or so ago, former President Trump stated the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment could be overturned with an executive order. Could you speak on the, she put in parentheses, unconstitutionality of that and the history of the anti-birthright citizenship sentiment?
That's a brilliant question because, again, showing you how much of our Reconstruction laws and amendments are so important for us today. These were laws and amendments passed in order to enfranchise former citizens, but they have acted in a way that has expanded the rights of immigrants to this country. So for the longest time, those people who try to exclude Chinese immigrants from this country, they would have cases where they said, well, you can't do that if they were born in this country because of birthright citizenship. It was in order to enfranchise former slaves, but it expanded the rights of all immigrants. So if you're an immigrant and you came here and you had children who were born here, they automatically become citizens. Now, this has been a point of attack by conservatives who have been somewhat anti-immigrant in their sentiments in the recent past. And that has been unfortunate because even Trump's speculation that he could get rid of the birthright citizenship of the 14th Amendment by an executive order. Now, I mean, I don't even know how anyone can say that because you can't, by an executive order, invalidate a part of the US Constitution. You have to have another amendment to invalidate a part of the US Constitution, like prohibition. They passed a constitutional amendment and then they had another one that rescinded it. So if you want to rescind birthright citizenship, you would have to pass a constitutional amendment. You can't do it by executive order. So I would call that somewhat ignorant and fruitless speculation on his part, which is, of course, no longer relevant. But I think he really wanted to do that. And his own people said, sorry, you can't dismantle the US Constitution by an executive order. But birthright citizenship has become politicized recently, mainly because of the rise of nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And this notion that somehow people are, they were highly racist and objectionable terms that were used to attack it. I remember since Rush Limbaugh just died yesterday, they would use the term anchor babies, that somehow immigrants had this plan to come to the United States and have a lot of babies to make them into citizens. Well, they were actually coming here to provide much needed labor in the farms and factories of the United States and have been the frontline workers in our pandemic. They've not come here just to have babies. But I think this is an unfortunate attack on the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is constantly being attacked because of its far-reaching clauses: birthright citizenship, equality before the law for all persons. Even though it used the word male, the equality before the law is for all persons. And people, disfranchised groups, including women, have used that very profitably.
Thank you. And then I'm going to start in the Q&A part. So we have an anonymous person asked, what are your thoughts on Trump's 1776 Commission report? Not necessarily what it says, but how it promotes the ideas that historians are anti-American and in general should not be trusted.
Well, I think those who are, propagating a sanitized, mythic version of American history are anti-American. because dissent in the United States has always been the highest form of patriotism, beginning from the abolitionists to civil rights activists to activists today in the movement for Black lives. That's the highest form of patriotism. And guess who began his career as a dissenter? Lincoln. He called the Mexican War a land grab for slavery. He was an anti-war person in the middle of a war that the United States was prosecuting. I guess they would think Lincoln is anti-American. So, it is really important to understand the ideals that American democracy stands for, the right to dissent, the freedom of speech and press. These things are important ideals. They don't just count when you think it's convenient for your cause. They count for everybody. The 1776 Commission, I think the problem with that is that it is not patriotism, it's jingoism. And there's a difference between that. The greatest American patriots have been the ones who have pushed this country forward. I wouldn't call Jefferson Davis a patriot. I wouldn't call the Confederate flag, which was a flag raised by traders in order to defend human bondage in this country, as being patriotic. The people who comprise that commission, Trump himself admires the Confederate flag. Now, I like the Union flag. I like the stars and stripes, and don't defile it by putting Nazi symbols and Confederate symbols on it. Those were traitors to American democracy. Being a patriot means being a Black Union Army soldier, not a white Southern slaveholder taking up arms against the American Republic. Defending the names of military bases named after Confederate generals during the Jim Crow era, which even the US Army is against, is not patriotism. That's treason. So I think these are highly politicized, bad faith arguments. I think it's really important to, in fact, be patriotic. I think it is important for people of all different political persuasions to be patriotic and in good faith fight for our ideals. The 1776 Commission, I'm afraid, is a charade. It's a parody of patriotism.
Thank you for that. Here's another one for you. Did Reconstruction and the Andrew Johnson, that's how they worded it, worsen race relations in the US? They said they feel like once Reconstruction started, that's when the South started to concentrate their frustrations for how the war went into establishing racist laws to imprison Black Americans.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the problem with much of the white South, certainly the former Confederates, and this is not true of all Southerners, because there were Southern whites who were Unionists, predominantly from non-slaveholding areas, and who joined the Reconstruction project. But Southern elites, certainly former slaveholders and planters, did not like the results of the war. They thought they would win. They thought they would form their own independent slave republic, and they kept fighting. People think they lost the war and they went by. No, they were Confederate generals like Nathan Bedford Forrest, like John B. Gordon, who joined the Ku Klux Klan, and ex-Confederate soldiers. And what they could not win through war, they tried to win through guerrilla warfare virtually, and by just sheer racist terror in the South. So what they were fighting against, you're right, is against the Reconstruction project of having Black citizenship. Once you didn't have slavery, you could not have Black people live in a kind of a no man's land between slavery and freedom. They were either going to be equal citizens or they were going to be second-class citizens, as they were in many northern states before the war. Interestingly enough, the Reconstruction amendments not only gave equality and voting rights to Black men in the South, but also in the North. There were states like Indiana. Indiana was really bad when it came to Black rights. They had Black laws. Illinois, many of the states in the Midwest, especially with strong Southern immigration, discriminated against African Americans. So yeah, I think you're right. There was a lot of violent pushback against the project of an interracial democracy and Black equality and citizenship in this country. And it continues to be contested by people, but they belong to the wrong side of history. I'm sorry, you keep saying, that you think you are a patriot, but you're not. And the other question that you asked was really interesting about the criminal exception. What Southerners tried to do immediately after the war was they passed these laws called the Black Codes that were like a new form of the slave codes, in which they criminalized Black freedom, in which they tried to forcefully take Black labor as they had during slavery, where they made vagrancy criminal. If you worked on your own, it was criminal. Your children could be taken away from you to work in farms, etc. They were really awful. And that's when Congress reacted. It reacted against the Black codes by passing the civil rights laws and Reconstruction. So in a way, Southerners were fighting against this all along, even before the Reconstruction laws. But after Reconstruction falls, after Black people lose political power, they are very inventive. They develop these convict leased labor systems where they criminalize Black freedom simply by, accusing them of petty crimes or even of non-existent crimes, like just being rude to a white person, imprisoning them, and then using their labor. This is what historians call worse than slavery, where people were literally worked to death in prison labor camps in the South, men and women too, by the way. And this was pretty awful. This kind of mass incarceration and criminalization, the convict leased labor system, again, one of the worst chapters in American history. But we still live with its after effects. I mean, just recently in Florida, they passed a law giving people the right to vote, people who had been, imprisoned and then had paid their dues to society and then were freed, but had their right to vote taken away from them. These are old, true and tried tactics of disfranchisement in the South, but the convict leased labor system has to be one of the worst that grew up in the post-Reconstruction South. Yeah.
Thank you. And there's a couple in here that are kind of similar, so I'll try to blend the questions so we can make time for more. But it's basically, we often hear that we need to know or learn history so we don't repeat it. So what are some good ways for us as individuals or even as teachers? How do we inform ourselves and inform our students on some of these topics? Or the best way to do it?
Yeah, I think it's really important not to be held captive to the problems of the past. And, the moment we start teaching history in an uncritical way, or trying to make people feel that somehow that if they don't take a certain stance, that somehow their own personal identities are being attacked. We really need to get away from that kind of history. We need to be able to talk about history and appeal to our students' reason and conscience to think about these things, right? I teach classes, that are very diverse and mixed, and in Connecticut, they tend to be predominantly white. And a lot of those students come to me and tell me that their parents were taught the sort of lost cause mythology of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And my first attempt is not to sort of kind of indoctrinate them or anything, it's just to lay out the history to them and say, well, what do you think? You think about this, And I think our young people are pretty smart. They're quite capable of reading this history and knowing what it is. And this notion that somehow we are overturning the way history is done is simply not correct. Because if you look at the history of American history, it's always been taught differently at different time periods. For a long time, it was okay for American academics to say, oh, Black people deserve to be enslaved, that they were somehow, quote, not civilized enough, that they were meant to be slaves. This was actually taught in US classrooms. So was that okay? No, it wasn't. That was biased history. So to say that somehow teaching history critically today comes with a political agenda, forgets that for a long time, misinformation and really bad history was taught in American classrooms. And I think as a history teacher, the best way for you to reach your students is to just tell them exactly how complex the past was, not to whitewash anything, but also not to do it with a way that might alienate your students to think, oh no, I'm being personally attacked here. You don't have to be. You don't have to be personally involved. You could be a direct descendant of a slaveholder, like Robert E. Lee's descendant, who's a minister and who completely disavows his ancestor and says, take down his statues. I can't stand the man and what he stood for. He's a decent human being, and he is an American Democrat, and can see this clearly. So if he can, I think a majority of white citizens in this country should also be able to do so. And that's why I teach Lincoln a lot. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was not at the forefront. There were a lot of Black and white abolitionists who were way ahead of him when it came to rights. But Lincoln is a good example of a decent man with sincere anti-slavery feelings, who then is able to grow in his views, and who is eventually able to come to the right spot. I think a lot of us need to be aware of that. We need to be taught the real story of Martin Luther King, the real story of Nelson Mandela, the real story of Frederick Douglass, the real story of Lincoln, rather than politicians using them selectively and in bad faith to make the opposite argument.
Here's an interesting one, and I think it'll kind of tie in with how we can stay more informed and help. Are there any popular media sources like documentaries, podcasts, social media that you would recommend for us to stay informed?
Yes, I wrote a piece for a magazine on how slavery is portrayed in many films and in television stories, and it's really important for us to look at popular culture, because the lost cause mythology of the South triumphed not only in academia till Nazism and the Second World War made racism intellectually unfashionable, but also in popular culture and Hollywood films like Gone with the Wind, that portrayed these really insidious stories about slavery. I mean, even worse than that is Birth of a Nation. Luckily, no one sees that horror anymore, but, it is important for us to look at films that are accurate. I mean, I would say 12 Years a Slave is great, because I used to actually teach Solomon Northrop's narrative. And then I told my students, go see the movie, because it's actually a very accurate description of the narrative itself. In terms of podcasts, there are lots of really good history podcasts out there. And I'm trying to think of one or two that would be good. There's one by Colin Woodward that I really like, because he looks at my period, the Civil War Reconstruction era. He's very good. There's an Age of Jackson podcast for the early 19th century run by a graduate student from Stanford, Daniel Golota, which is also good. There's Greg Popkovich has a Civil War podcast where I did an interview on my book with him. I thought that was a very good one too. So there are a lot of history professors and students doing podcasts and trying to reach a broader audience. I started writing for the broader public because I felt, oh my God, I mean, people don't know this. I mean, I can teach my students in my Civil War class, which tends to be rather big because it's a Civil War class, but I wanted to reach a broader American audience. So I started writing for the New York Times. So I wrote this piece on the first impeachment of Trump and Johnson, on the elections, etc. I really started doing that, I think, when President Obama ran for the presidency in 2008, and I haven't stopped since. And it's been really good because I have been able to reach a much broader audience, because I write my history textbooks, but how many people are going to read my books? The articles are a good way, and that's why I ended with the New York Review of Books with that piece, that link, because I think historians are doing that. A lot of people say, "Oh, historians don't write for the public," and I'm like, really? But there are tons of us doing it. So yeah. I would tell you to follow those and check out History News Network. History News Network is a website that actually every week has newsletters that it puts out where it summarizes recent news of historical significance. It's called HNN. It's run out of George Washington University. It's a really good place, one place where you can go to for all the articles, for all the podcasts, and all the sort of relevant stuff for our world today. Yeah.
I wrote that one down for myself. Thank you. And then I think we've got time for maybe one more, so we'll end it on kind of an upbeat note. What made you so passionate about history?
A personal story. So, it's so funny. I grew up in India, like I told you, and I come from a family of historians. My father was actually in the army, but he was a military historian. And my mother was a Gandhian and had been involved in in India's nationalist movement. She actually had a bachelor's in 1949, which was very unusual for a woman of her generation. She's still alive in India. She's 94. She just turned 94. But and our family table was just a conversation constantly about history. We only spoke about history. And my parents, my father had served in the British Indian Army during the Second World War. My mother was a Gandhian. So they had really interesting conversations. My sister is a historian at the University of Michigan. I'm a historian. My older sister was a history teacher for a long time. My brother was a diplomat but got a master's in history. So we all became historians. It was what we talked about around the dinner table every day. We only talked about history and India's nationalist movement. And, my father can actually plot American Civil War battles better than I can because he's a military historian. So, I really sort of grew up with it and always wanted to be a historian. And then ended up coming here to the US because I saw a lot of similarities between India's nationalist struggle and decolonization in Asia and Africa and the civil rights movement in this country. And I found these really interesting connections. Martin Luther King actually visited India. There are a lot of connections. There are new books that talk about connections. Of course, now our vice president is African American and Indian American. And I wrote a piece on that too for the New York Times, why Kamala Harris matters to me, looking at the connections. So for me personally, I became interested in issues of race and democracy, came to the US and just kind of worked my way back to slavery.
Great, thank you so much. And I don't know if Dr. Beebe or Dr. Hughes has any closing statements to finish us out here.
Dr. Sinha, thank you so much. This was enlightening, insightful, just a very amazing talk, linking our history to our present. So thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. We're so glad to have you. And thank you to everyone else that joined us. This is just amazing. We had a great turnout, and I love USI and I love the College of Liberal Arts. So thank you so much. Dean Beebe, did you want to say something?
I just want to say thank you as well. That this was wonderful, just amazing information and the passion that you have for history and to explain so many complex things and to show that long arc that bends towards righteousness, as we say, is wonderful, and that there are sides in history, and what side are you going to take is important. And so I just really appreciate it. I have 8-year-old twins here who might just burst into this room any moment, so I'll keep this really short. But I just want to say thank you. And I think our students have learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and it's just been a pleasure and an honor to listen to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you, Sakina, Sri, and James. Thank you. It was my pleasure.